We've just come through a very hard winter when the homeless are top of mind, but homelessness is a year-round problem. As a community, how do we move beyond temporary winter shelters to help the homeless find permanent homes? How are agencies teaming up to create better long-term solutions? We'll discuss this and more today. Hello and welcome to Living United, a show about how our community can be the change for those most in need. I'm Ann McNeil, United Way volunteer and manager of corporate citizenship and corporate affairs for IBM. Today I'm joined by leaders of two United Way agencies that serve the homeless. My studio guests are Carson Dean, executive director of the Men's Shelter of Charlotte, and Stephen Smith, executive director of Charlotte Family Housing. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Ann.
Yeah, we were talking about this winter weather, and it was quite a winter. I would call it a true winter last week, which is unusual for Charlotte. But certainly makes you, I think it makes us all think about homelessness probably more, because you think about people being cold, and we're going to obviously delve into that later. But before we go too deeply, if I could ask each of you to, on a high level, talk a little bit more about each of your agencies and how you serve the homeless. And Carson, if you could start, please.
Sure. The Men's Shelter of Charlotte, our mission is to provide safe emergency shelter while we work to end homelessness for each man we serve. Part of how we do that is we're not only an emergency shelter, in fact, we're the only emergency shelter for men in our community, but we're much more than that. We're one of the largest housing providers in our community as well. That's something that's very important to us that not as many people know.
Right.
Because our agency is really about solutions to homelessness instead of managing homelessness.
Right.
And the way we kind of show that is through what we call our equation. And for us, the solution ending homelessness is income plus housing plus support is what equals an end to homelessness. So that's really what we focus on every day.
Great. And Stephen, what about your organization?
Well, thanks, Ann. Thanks for having me here
Absolutely.
today, too. I really appreciate it. At Charlotte Family Housing, our goal is self-sufficiency for our clients, and it's typically families. It's moms and children, and we look to help them move to self-sufficiency by empowering them to sustain housing.
Right.
And so that's really what we do. I mean, that would boil it down to those three words: self-sufficiency, empowerment, and sustained housing.
So I'm seeing a theme here,
Sure.
definitely. When we talk about the homeless in the city, you hear different numbers. And how do you count the homeless, and who is considered to be homeless? And Carson, could you talk a little bit about the difference and how those numbers are counted, and who's considered to be homeless in our community?
And that's something that is not an exact science. And
Sure.
we're never going to have a number because there are different ways that depend on different funding sources and regulatory sources. But in Charlotte, we typically agree that there are anywhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people who are experiencing homelessness on any given night. One of the ways that we count that is through what's called a point-in-time count. And this is something that's actually not just done here, but around the country. It's mandated through Congress by HUD to do every year. The limitation of the point-in-time count is it's only on one night. So it gives us a snapshot of how many people we can count on one particular night who are either in shelters, on the streets, or in transitional housing programs. So there's some limitation towards finding out how many people are experiencing homelessness in our community. I think the exact number is not nearly as important as where we see the trends with the numbers going from year to year.
Right.
I think that's really
Yeah.
more important than trying to say there are X number of people and or families experiencing homelessness in Charlotte.
Right, okay. And I'm sure we'll get into some of those trends in a few minutes. Stephen, can you talk a little bit about what the different providers do around homelessness? Because again, each of your agencies have a slightly, different angle of how you're supporting, services and programs for homeless and helping them get out of being homeless. But if you can talk a little bit more about what other providers we have and what they're doing as well.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I really echo what Carson said about it's really looking at the trends, because I think our community has been just tremendous in really helping are chronic homeless folks. And so we have agencies like Urban Ministry Center and More Place that really focus on chronic homelessness, and that's vital. We've got agencies that deal with folks that are homeless that deal with addiction issues.
Right.
You know, folks that are homeless that deal with mental health issues or domestic violence issues,
Right.
because so many of these issues overlap.
Right.
So homelessness is really, it's symptomatic of so many other things. And fortunately, we have such a great community that we have lots of different organizations that are helping. I mean, I think of a Child's Place that deals with children and so forth. So a ton of different agencies that really are working collaboratively and finding ways, whether it's crisis assistance ministry or any number that I
Right.
could mention, that are really working to solve homelessness at different parts and pieces. Does that
Right.
make sense?
It does, and I think, the one thing that we talk about a lot on this show is how, folks will talk about how when they're making a donation to United Way, how do I know that the money's going where it needs to go? And I think that the homeless network is a great example of how there's not the overlap, because you guys are all working in concert together,
Right.
to figure out where the needs are, and you're each taking different pieces of it versus duplication of services, et cetera. And I think that. And that's been going on in this particular area for a number of years, Carson. How long? I mean, it's been years that you guys have had this pretty strong network.
There really has. It's been,
Yeah.
for the last 20 years or so,
Right.
there have been a number of agencies who are constantly working together. I think at times there's been a call for how do we keep folks from duplicating what
Sure,
each
yeah.
other are doing. But part of that duplication, if you want to look at it that way, is actually necessary because of the sheer number of people that we're sometimes trying to help. And the fact that an agency might be able to serve a person differently according to their needs
Sure.
than another agency. So
Right.
we may have somebody that we could serve, but it might be that they are better served by one of our other partner agencies.
Right.
And so there's that much need in our community.
Sure. Well, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, a great example of some really cool partnership that took place was just in this last month with the Silver Oaks issue with the apartment. And there were about, and Carson, you correct me if I'm wrong, it was close to 200 folks that could have been displaced. And
Yeah.
various agencies came together and said, let's really be proactive about this. Let's
Right.
figure out a way to work together to really sort of triage and find places where these folks can plug in, and so they're not, just, during the
statistic,
holidays,
yeah.
another statistic,
Right.
over the holidays,
Yeah.
in a really, really tough spot.
Well,
So-
and that's great. And on the subject of specialization, we're going to take a look now at an agency that focuses specifically on the homeless who are fighting drug addictions. Let's watch the video now.
Hope Haven provides a foundation of recovery for single men and women, as well as families that are in early recovery from alcoholism and other substance abuse, providing life skills that will lead to their independence. Everyone that comes to us is homeless and is in early recovery from alcoholism or other substance abuse. And they can live with us from 6 months to about 2 years, always on a person-centered plan. A person-centered plan means that each person that comes in here, of the 150 to 180 people we have at any given time, each has a plan that has been worked out between them and their counselor with their goals so that we can help them accomplish the goals that they have for their future. At the Villages of Hope Haven, we average having about 160 men, women, and children on site. One of the things that we found when we began this program at Hope Haven is that many of the homeless aren't people that have had jobs in recent years or have come from prison and have a struggle finding a job. So we began having vocational training programs on site which would teach them basic skills in food preparation, commercial laundry, maintenance, and that includes large building as well as our grounds maintenance, and catering. Of course, we have a very successful catering company. this prepares our folks not only to be able to have the skills to get a job, but it also prepares them for interviews and how to answer resume questions and the things that they need to know to be a successful employee. Being a United Way agency is very important to Hope Haven. Of course, upfront, the financial aspect is certainly important, but it goes so much deeper than that. First of all, it gives us a credibility in the community because we have met the requirements to become a United Way agency. It also opens doors to us that we would never have opened otherwise, for volunteers, for donors, for so many things. So it is a very important part of Hope Haven. Charlotte has an amazing continuum of care when dealing with the homeless. There are so many agencies that are doing such good work in so many areas, but it takes all of us. It takes the shelters, it takes the support services, it takes transitional housing for many, it takes permanent housing for others. It takes all of us working together.
So that's a good example of how an agency that focuses on one key issue can really help that specific population. But there's also a strong need for agencies to collaborate too, and that leads me to come back to, we were starting to talk a little bit about collaboration, that there's a new initiative that through the United Way and the agencies, and maybe beyond the agencies, that's going on, and I wanted to, a coordinated assessment, you're calling it. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. So coordinated assessment is actually mandate through HUD, Housing and Urban Development. It was part of the 2009 HARTH Act, so it's legislation. We're required by August of 2014 to have what they're calling a coordinated assessment system in place in our community, like in every community around the country. And the way I look at coordinated assessment is that it is a tool. It's a way to help agencies better coordinate the services that they're providing, but as importantly, and I think this is kind of the game changer in coordinated assessment, instead of using a tool that is a back office tool for the agencies to communicate, this is really going to be a tool that allows the consumers, those who are experiencing homeless, whether they're families or individuals or youth, to basically have a no wrong door approach. There will be a place, or probably a number of places in our community, where folks will be able to go, not to then be referred somewhere else, but to actually be assessed, have their needs assessed, and to be able to then determine who's the best agency within the coordinated assessment system to serve them and immediately connect to them. So for example, if somebody shows up at one of the coordinated assessment sites that's not the men's shelter, and it's determined that we're the most appropriate placement, then folks would be able to use that tool at that agency to even be able to say, yes, and there's beds available, and so we're going to get you connected there right now. The difference is the system that we've had is where people could go to agencies, but it was up to the consumer to figure out where to go, and they got referred a lot of places, so they bounced around a lot, and they had to keep telling their story over and over and over. And imagine when you're in the middle of a crisis and you're asked your story, and so you tell it, and then the person says, well, I'm sorry, we can't help you, so go to this other agency. And the first thing when you get there, they're going to say, so tell us your story. This way, somebody will be able to collect the upfront meaningful information about the family or the person and log that. And so the story doesn't have to be repeated. The next agency might be able to delve deeper to make sure that they're giving them the appropriate level of care. But in many ways, that's really what coordinated assessment is about. The other piece to it that's a little bit different is this is not a homeless service agency's initiative. This is truly a community initiative. While we're mandated to do it, if we receive federal funds, we all kind of have to be in this one together. And I think part of what's been great in Charlotte is that there have been some guiding forces behind coordinated assessment. The United Way particularly has kind of stepped into a leadership role of convening agencies and the community to talk about it. Because each community is allowed to build it in such a way that serves the unique community's needs. And so the United Way has brought in faith organizations, the general public, the service providers, national experts to guide our kind of process. The Foundation for the Carolinas has been a big proponent of the coordinated assessment system. And so by having these community leaders kind of stepping out and saying, this looks good for our community, and we really want y'all to work on it together, that goes a long way in Charlotte. I mean,
Absolutely.
that's an important piece in
Absolutely,
Charlotte,
yeah.
is when we can get the whole community rallied, we do some really great things.
So how far into the process are you guys with this?
We are anticipating launching our coordinated assessment, the very beginnings of it, in May. The
Okay.
first part of May. We on March 7th, the agencies who have applied to be these coordinated assessment centers will be notified who's been selected and how they're going to do it, and then that gives us a little bit of time to prepare staffing and those things.
Sure.
We're ready to go in May. However, it's going to be phased in over several years. I mean, we won't be able to do all of it on day one.
Right.
A lot of it also has to do with a database that we use.
I was going to say data. I work at IBM. I know about this.
Yeah, that's really important, and we all use it. We're all participants in a statewide database.
Right.
Although our data is really kind of tracked locally, and so some of it has to do with coordinating that aspect of it as well.
Right.
But it really will be phased in so that we can do a piece, learn from it,
Pilot.
fix
and
the
move.
things we need to
Pilot,
fix,
yep,
and then continue to
Exactly.
progress on. Because the last thing that we want to do is roll out something that we as agencies aren't really ready for.
Right, or comfortable with, like you're
And then the
saying, yeah.
folks that we serve kind of get thrown into a lot of confusion because we're not ready.
So let's talk about the process as it is now, kind of the trail of what happens. I'm homeless, I come to X agency. We'll say, your agency. Take me through the steps, what it looks like now and what someone's going, we've talked a little
Sure.
bit, but go ahead and take me through the steps.
Yeah, because at the men's shelter, we've actually been doing this for a number of years. We didn't call it coordinated assessment. We just knew when folks showed up that we needed to figure out what was going on, what were their needs today, what were their long-term needs, and figure out how to kind of plug them in appropriately. As far as when somebody finds themselves in a homeless experience, how that then plays out, there's so many different scenarios. It's kind of hard to have a typical situation. But in general, whether it's a family or an individual, usually their support system has eroded to the point where they need to turn to someone else for help.
Right.
And that would be one of the homeless agencies. Oftentimes it's showing up at an emergency shelter. And then from there, after basic needs are met and they're given a safe place to stay, it's usually then making those connections. Like at the men's shelter, we have in the past, we've connected folks to Charlotte Family Housing.
Right,
Because
sure.
that's the next most appropriate step. So it's kind of knowing where to connect people and then get them connected. Part of coordinated assessment is going to streamline that a little bit because we're all going to kind of say, this is the part I know our agency can do and do well. And so that's what we're going to focus on.
Right.
And we're probably not going to continue to dabble in some things that we used to do because they were meaningful or
Right,
historically we did them. But we're going to focus on what we really can do, and everybody will know that and know to kind of get people headed in the right direction.
Well, and it's going to make you better at the area that your focus area of doing a better job.
Absolutely,
ultimately.
because the end game is to help people move out of their homeless
Exactly,
experience
yep.
and into self-sufficiency with the support so they don't have to come back at any point in the system. That's
Right.
really our end game.
Ultimate goal, yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
And I just want to piggyback one
Yeah.
thing that Carson said that I think is just so great about this process. It's the fact that the client will not have to continually retell their story agency to agency.
Right.
So one of the things that we do at Charlotte Family Housing is when we're working with our families, we use what's called a trauma-informed care approach. And I'm certainly no expert on trauma-informed care. Our clinical social workers do an
Sure.
awesome job at that. But I know just enough to be dangerous. And one of the things that I've heard is that it is just so re-traumatizing for these families to
Right.
just go and tell the same story over again. And it's almost as if that underlying stress and trauma of being homeless, and when you're retelling that story, is very, very tough, and it sort of takes an emotional toll on a family.
Sure.
And I kind of liken it to if you're sleep deprived, and you know how it's just so tough to function sleep deprived.
Right,
You just,
yeah.
and how do you stay focused on what you need to stay focused on when you're deprived of sleep?
Right.
And I think there, and again, I'm not an expert on
Sure.
trauma-informed care, but I think there were certainly some similarities.
Right.
And so this process is really one that's going to help our families and
Yeah.
help the homeless
And,
folks. that
and I
come.
would imagine the first time you tell the story,
Mm-hmm.
you remember every aspect of it and you think of everything. But as you continue, you start to, I would assume, almost become numb as well, as we're talking about, and it becomes harder to remember all those little pieces that
Right.
could really make a difference when you're telling this person.
That's exactly
of
right.
where they send you
That's
or how they're going to help you.
The story changes.
Yeah.
And it's not because the events change or
Right.
that people are misleading anybody. It's
No.
that you get tired of telling that story.
same story.
And so
Right.
you start to truncate it. So
Exactly,
I've
yep.
already said it. Let me just give you the basics.
Let me give you the elevator speech of
Right,
it. And
exactly.
then it's yeah.
And we also know that the story that somebody tells when they first appear at an agency is not the complete story. And we need to do enough of the triage to
Right.
get them to an agency that can immediately start building trust so that the story can then evolve, so that agency can truly find out all the things that are going on so that they can then do what's needed to help.
Right, and that person feels safe to
Absolutely.
share more information. That's the key,
that's
right?
absolutely
Right.
true.
Yeah, yeah. So how much, I mean, we're talking about homeless and you know, we've given a couple of examples of what homeless is, but how much homeless is unseen or, you know, what's out there that, you know, what's the real numbers? And again, I know you do the one night, but there are many other types of homeless, you know, from people living with
Yeah.
families and friends, which probably that's not where they want to be, you know, et cetera. Can you,
Right.
can you talk a little bit more about what's the definition?
Yeah, well, you know, people are, you know, Carson alluded to the point in time count.
Yeah.
But there are things that, you know, you have situations where folks are doubled up. You have
Yep.
situations where they're, you know, they're in a motel. They're on the precipice of homelessness.
Right.
So there's a lot of, and that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to count and get an
Right.
accurate number.
Yeah.
Because you're dealing with a transitory population.
Yeah.
And this is, in some respects, it's a little easier. In some respects, none of these are perfect scenarios, but in some respects, chronic, homeless, those that have been on the street for a year,
Right.
you know, those that are living in the woods, you know,
Right, sure.
in some respects, it's you can quantify that population a little bit easier than you can quantify more of the transitory
Right.
folks, the folks that are
Right.
sort of in those shadows.
Yeah.
And but fortunately, we've got a community that is just tremendous, you know, in trying to bring value and find solutions to all of these problems, whether it's chronic, whether it's
Well, yeah, and that brings up a point. The local faith community is very involved in this. Can you talk a little bit about maybe a couple of examples of how the local faith community is engaged?
well, I
in this
mean,
work?
I think about, you know, what several agencies in town are nonprofit agencies because someone in the faith community
Right.
was inspired to act.
Yeah.
Who sort of answered the call, who was my neighbor, and said, we've got to do something. And so, you know, the roots of so many of our agencies are based in the faith community.
Yeah.
And fortunately, they are just tremendous partners. I mean, it's not just financially, because
Right.
they have been great financial partners, but also investing in lives of people.
Yeah.
Because almost irrespective of what faith culture you're coming from,
Right.
the value and dignity of someone not having a roof over their head is pretty universal.
Yeah.
I mean, probably
Yeah.
not exclusively, but
Right.
it's pretty universal. And so they have been. It's been a thrill to as sort of a new entry into the nonprofit world to see the faith community kind of rally and support and really be a driving force behind the work
Right.
that we
Well,
do.
and it's such a you know, thread of our community.
Yes.
You know,
It is.
Charlotte is that so much part of who we are.
Absolutely.
You know, and speaking of Charlotte, I want to go beyond Charlotte because what our situation looks like may look very different than other communities. But can you talk a little bit about maybe the difference of Charlotte's homeless, how we handle it, and how we look compared to say a Raleigh or a Greensboro, or one, you know, another larger city in the state?
Sure, absolutely. In fact, I came out of Raleigh, where I worked, where I ran the
Yeah.
shelter there as well. I think a couple things. I think the first point, back to what Stephen was saying, is the faith community. The faith community is such an integral part of how we address homelessness in our community that in many other communities it's not as vibrant. It's not as much of a part of it.
They're
And
not as much of a partner, in other words.
they're not
they
a
may
partner. They do a
support,
lot
but-
of things,
Right.
and they provide a lot of
but
support.
they're not at the table necessarily.
In Charlotte, we do not try to do any initiative that works
Without.
on solutions to homelessness without having the faith community at the table.
Right.
Which is why when United Way kind of launched this coordinated assessment
Mm-hmm.
piece, it was launched at a church. And that's where the public
Right.
launch was held. The other more tangible difference in Charlotte is we actually only have 2 emergency shelter providers. So we have an emergency shelter provider for men, and we have an emergency shelter provider for women and women with children. And we've worked together on dealing with some intact families as well. In a lot of communities, including Raleigh, you might have 3 or 4 different shelters that serve both men and women. And so there's different places where people are going and different ways it's done. In some communities, there may only be 1 shelter that just does what they can for everybody, and then a lot of smaller churches or others that may open their doors during the winter.
Right.
But the fact that Charlotte already has kind of a very defined homeless services system, and if you look at the kind of blueprint of what our system looks like, to somebody who doesn't do this work, it can look very confusing. Ours is a very simple system when it's compared to a lot of other places. And that's good because it allows us to be flexible enough to move when we need to move to accomplish things. I think the other part is one of the differences in Charlotte is rapid rehousing is now one of the best practices around the country, where we are getting people out of their homeless experience and into housing very quickly. In most communities, somebody starts in a shelter and then goes to an agency that works on rapid rehousing.
Right.
In Charlotte, rapid rehousing exists in some of the partner agencies, but it also exists in both of our shelter agencies. And so people can move directly from shelter to housing without having to go through other steps unless that's what they need or really want. And I think the last piece of that, which also goes along with the faith community, is not to say that in other communities leadership is lacking.
Right.
But in Charlotte, leadership is such an important piece of it. And it's not, in a lot of communities, leadership may come from local government or the faith community. In Charlotte, leadership is coming from the business community. I mean, there's a long history in Charlotte of that, especially out of the financial services and banking community. But it's also coming from the faith community. It's coming from the nonprofit world, and including leadership like the United Way's role in helping get people together, whether they're partner agencies or not. But also in Charlotte, there's a lot of leadership coming out of the philanthropic community. And that's a big difference than what I've seen in some other communities where philanthropy plays a role in a lot of communities, and usually that's a funding role. In Charlotte, our philanthropic community, whether it's corporate foundations, Foundation for the Carolinas, United Way, it also comes with involvement of those leaders and their boards and their stakeholders, which I think is really important because when we get all the voices together, we can do a lot of great things, and we're able to, kind of influence each other to do what's best for our community. I think that doesn't exist in some of the other communities we look at, whether it's because of their size or because of their resources or just the uniqueness of those different communities. And Raleigh's a good example. It's a government town.
Right.
And so government plays a really strong role, and that's fine. I came out of it, and it worked really well in Raleigh.
Right.
It wouldn't work as well in Charlotte.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to end with one last question, and then we've got the show's going to be over. It went by very quickly today. We see people on the street, and sometimes they're asking for money. We'll work for food. What is the best way that I can help a person who's homeless? Quickly.
Yeah, I think the best way is to try, and it might sound a little weird, but to try to get them connected to an agency. Try to
Make
get them
that connection.
Make that connection to an agency
Yeah.
is really the best way.
All right, great. Well, great way to end the show. Thank you both for being my guests today, and thank you so much for all that you do to help so many others in our community. We appreciate it. To our viewing audience, if you want to get involved in helping create solutions here in our community, please visit the website shown on your screen. And if you are a member of our viewing community who needs help, please call 211 24 hours a day. If you call 211, they're going to connect you with a referral specialist who can help you find services such as housing and employment and more. I'm Ann McNeil. Thank you. We'll see you next time.